The second analogy of nature is on page 25. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. The second analogy is that a very savage man enters a magnificent military barracks. He sees the general joint drills and orderly movements of a very disciplined army. At the movement of a single soldier, a battalion, a regiment, a division stands up, sits down, and moves. He observes that they fire at a command to fire. A very savage man enters a magnificent military barracks. For instance, when it says savage here, it means he enters such a place for the first time. He sees a barracks for the first time in his life. He sees a barracks department. That is such a thing. For example, a savage man is called a mountain man. For example, the dictionary equivalent is mountain man, meaning someone who has not seen a city, has not seen people, has not seen human relations. He doesn't know. He cannot reason. Of course, since he doesn't know this time either. Here it specifically says savage because it is related to the person, meaning it is related to the person who contemplates these matters. His way of contemplating, his way of understanding issues. When we come to the reality, what is knowledge? The existence of knowledge, for instance, what is a law? Is a law material? Is it spiritual? Is it related to knowledge? Can a law be power? Can it not be? Meaning he doesn't know these details. He is even unaware of knowledge. As it says here, he initially imagines and has a very simple mental structure. That is, he is not someone who can deeply examine events, investigate finely, and see all the subtleties. And indeed, these people are like that. For example, when we look at atheists, they are unaware of many issues, many matters. That's why it specifically emphasizes this by saying savage man. And a very savage man enters a magnificent military barracks. A barracks department, but magnificent, grand, large. He sees the general joint drills and orderly movements of a very disciplined army. What does he see? He sees the general joint drills and orderly movements of a very disciplined army. He entered the barracks. There is an army, a disciplined army. He sees the general joint drills and orderly movements of the army. At the movement of a single soldier, a battalion, a regiment, a division, stands up, sits down, and moves. He observes that they fire at a command to fire. Up to here is observation, only what they see. For example, when we look at a human being, at the human body or a cell, we see the same things there. An orderly system. A lot of those parts within it all move in an orderly manner, move together. The same thing is seen in particles, atoms, or cells, and a human sees the same thing like this. He observes that they fire at a command to fire. When his crude, savage mind fails to understand and denies the command by a commander through the state regulations and the Sultan's law, his crude, savage mind. For example, crude is added to savage. What does crude mean? Meaning not fine. He cannot see the subtleties. He cannot perceive the details. For example, the human eye is like that too. That is, if the eye is a bit impaired, one cannot see the subtleties. The mind is like that too. That is, it cannot perceive the subtleties. When his crude, savage mind fails to understand and denies the command by a commander through the state regulations and the Sultan's law. Now what is there? There are state regulations. There is the Sultan's law. For example, how will the soldiers' training movements be? Weapon. For example, when we did military service, there were 10 unarmed movements. There were 10 armed movements. For example, each movement consisted of 8 movements. Open rank was opened, and so on. Who determined those movements there? The state determined it, or the sultan determined it, or the commander, whatever. For instance, the movements were already drawn as pictures on paper. You open your hand, close it, crouch, stand up, and so on. For example, someone gives a command, but it's not according to their own liking. There is a predetermined order and discipline. They command the soldiers according to that. The soldiers move according to that. Because he doesn't know this, when his crude, savage mind fails to understand and denies the command by a commander through the state regulations and the Sultan's law. He is unaware of such a thing. He doesn't understand, so he denies it. He imagines that those soldiers are tied to each other with ropes. Yes. So there is this issue of ropes here. Indeed, he imagines that those soldiers are tied to each other with ropes. For example, nowadays we say plus atom, minus atom, for example, it's called plus, positive, negative, etc. For example, electron, proton, etc. For example, what does the man do? He perceives a bond between them. For example, he says attraction, positive attracts negative, negative attracts positive. For example, he says there is such an attraction between them. That is, there is something in between. It's not a rope holding the two. But he says there is a bond in the end. For example, in chemistry, covalent bond, ionic bond, hydrogen bond. That is, he says there is such a bond between atoms. It's the same thing. Why, for instance, does something hanging not break? For example, iron is hung, it doesn't break. For example, there's a bond between its atoms. But what is this bond? That is, there is such a thing, but where does it originate? Is it a rope like this, or is it something else? For example, what does a man do? Even in chemistry, etc., he says C for carbon and draws a line. He says oxygen, for example, he says there is a bond. He even draws a line. That is there normally a line between atoms? There is no such line. When you draw a line like this. He says there are bonds. Then normally an atom, for example, a proton is called positively charged. What is this thing called positive charge? For example, this is positively charged. For example, a proton is called positively charged. An electron is called negatively charged. What is this thing called charge? That is, what is on it? Can I explain? For example, this is just a definition, but in our minds, it's as if there is something in it. Then, so what is this? An apple, a pear, what is this? What happens when there's a positive charge? What is a positive charge? Is it a material thing, a spiritual thing? Right? For example, a name. What does the master say? They give a name to unknown things. They say they have solved it with that. For example, a name, for instance, it is said that positive attracts negative. Now he will say this too. That is a decree. It is a decree placed by Allah. He describes that decree as if it were a ruler there. For example, he describes the decree as the ruler. That is, after a while, he perceived the law as power. He will say it now, because atoms move. Well now, for example, in the first word he dealt with the causes, external causes. In the second he dealt with it by itself. Now the matter of atoms forming that thing by themselves. Can atoms do this? Can atoms do this? Then atoms cannot do it. They are mindless, unconscious. And he dealt with this in the second word. Now what remains? Laws remain. For example, he said at the beginning there are 4 paths. Efcetul esbab, causes necessitate. Teşekkül bizatihi, formed by itself. İktezetu tabiat, nature necessitates. The 4th is with the unity of existence of a necessary being. with his power then. Now, for the formation of a living being, for example, men ask how the first living being was formed. They say environmental conditions, air, water, sun, soil, etc. are the cause. What does the master say? These are mindless, unconscious, they flow like a flood. They cannot form such a living being. They cannot enter it. He dealt with its causes too. This time, if you say the atoms inside that living being do this, they are also mindless, unconscious. That's what he dealt with in the second word. Now, what else has science found? That is, there is something else that people have found. There are laws. That is, they research, wondering what it is. For example, the man looks and finds such laws. Positive attracts negative, mass attracts mass. Then there are events that occur in the same way continuously. For example, mass attract each other everywhere. The man finds the law this time. Okay, he says, I found something else. He says, I found a law. This time he tries to attribute it to the law. He sees he cannot attribute it to the atom because it is a mindless, unconscious thing. He passed that. Anyway, as he goes towards the first, second, and third word, the level of atheism also rises. At first, to air, water. Before that, chance. The most nonsensical is chance. For example, in the first, he does something like this. Finally, he sees that something has enveloped the entire universe, something that is the same in everything. So he chooses the stable one. Then here, while analyzing the nature of those laws, just as in the analogy here, it cannot be attributed to something called a rope. If such a thing doesn't exist, he will come to that point. He will say that although those laws have an existence in knowledge, they try to speak of them instead of power, as if they had a material existence. Then he says, he imagines that those soldiers are tied to each other with ropes. So where does this rope come from, for example, that savage man? How does he arrive at this idea of a rope? For example, he came and entered the barracks. He saw the orderly movements of the soldiers. There are ropes between them. He thinks that the rope is moving them. Where does this come from? How does he arrive at the rope? There is a result. There is an orderly movement. So he must explain it in some way. He cannot explain it by the soldiers themselves, because he dealt with that in the second word. If we put them in place of atoms, what will be the consequence? No, the atom cannot move by itself, and it cannot be made to move by other atoms from outside. He dealt with that in the first course. This time he is forced to say something like this. He has to say something. Then he says there are ropes between them, and those ropes are moving together. There must be something that encompasses all of them, a rope. Then he arrives at such an idea of a rope. He imagines that those soldiers are tied to each other with ropes. He thinks how wonderful a rope that imagination is. He is amazed. Then he goes and enters a very magnificent mosque, like Hagia Sophia, on a Friday. He was in the barracks, now in the mosque. He observes that the Muslim congregation stands up, bows, prostrates, and sits down at the sound of one man's voice. Here too, prayer is being performed. There is an imam. At the beginning, the imam says, Allahu Akbar, and goes into prostration, goes into bowing. The congregation also bows and prostrates with him. There was someone commanding the military personnel there. Here he sees the imam. He observes that the Muslim congregation stands up, bows, prostrates, and sits down at the sound of one man's voice. Because he does not understand the Sharia, which is the sum of spiritual and heavenly laws, and the spiritual principles that come from the commands of the owner of the Sharia. For example, how is prayer performed? The definition of how prayer is performed is in the Sharia. It is 4 units, rak'ahs. In each unit, the pillars are known, things are known. There is a definition of this prayer. That is, there is a definition in Sharia, in religion. The owner of the Sharia commanded it that way. They perform the prayer according to that. Because he does not understand the Sharia, which is the sum of spiritual and heavenly laws, and the spiritual principles that come from the commands of the owner of the Sharia. That is the thing in prayer. Everyone knows how prayer is performed. Everyone obeys those spiritual principles accordingly. Prayer is performed in that way. Because he doesn't know this. Imagining that the congregation is tied with material ropes, and that those strange ropes enslave them and make them move. Imagining that the congregation is tied with material ropes and that strange ropes enslave them and make them move. For example, in physicists' view, they say that in the nucleus of an atom, there is a proton. They say it's positively charged. And in the orbit, there is an electron, negatively charged. This positive attracts negative. This is a law. Now he says that positive attracts negative, meaning for this attraction to occur in the distance from the proton to the electron, they say there must be an intermediate particle. That is, how does this attraction reach from there to here? They say we haven't been able to discover or find this yet. Then they say it might be a photon. Or for example, there are protons in the nucleus of an atom. Normally positive attracts negative, right? Positive should also repel positive. Then they say, if there are 3 to 5 protons in the nucleus of an atom, since they are of the same pole, they should repel each other. They are stationary. They say there is a strong force, like a glue there. But they say that the strong force holding 2 atoms together must still have an intermediate particle. That is, they say there must still be a material thing to hold that thing. They say that, well, we haven't seen it yet, but they say there must be something. Or, for example, there's the attraction between the earth and the sun, called the gravitational force. The sun is there, the earth is here. How does this attraction happen? Okay, there is an attraction. The sun attracts, the earth attracts, they attract each other. But this attraction, they will affect each other. From here to there, from there to here, there must be an interaction particle in between. They say there must be a particle to carry this influence, this effect. They name this particle graviton. They say we haven't seen this particle yet, but let's name it now, just like what I've explained. That is, they put forward a theory. These are still in the theory stage, not proven. But the theory also has many more open aspects. Isn't it interesting? Yes. These are recent physics developments. So these are sentences in physics. The master says, some people of misguidance called materialists, within the orderly transformations of particles, felt a great manifestation of divine creativity and divine power, and being unable to know where that manifestation came from, and being unable to understand where the general force coming from the manifestation of the eternal power is managed, they began attributing divine effects and works to particles and their movements by imagining matter and force as eternal. That is, it is seen here. Some people of misguidance called materialists within the orderly transformations of particles There are orderly transformations in particles within orderly transformations. Now, what was said to be the smallest building block of matter? Atom was said. It was like this until the 1900s. Then protons, electrons, neutrons are discovered. They are all found together in certain years up to the 1930s. They say that this means the atom was not the smallest. They say there are three other things inside it. Then it goes a little further and says that proton and neutron inside the atom are not indivisible either. There are three more particles inside the proton and neutron. They find that too. They call these quarks. There are three in the neutron and three in the proton. After that, they haven't been able to go below the quark yet. Furthermore, if we continue with this logic in everything, for example, at one time the atom was called the smallest. They went down a level. The proton was found. The proton was called the smallest. They went inside that too. The quark was found. Tomorrow, if they go inside the quark, other things may come out. When they go inside, it goes on like this, the Master says. If it is to remain as matter, it will go on infinitely, he says. He says it is infinitely divisible. Now, for example, if we stay at the proton level, when we go down one level, it becomes a quark. When it becomes a quark, it becomes a single piece. That is, Allah creates the quark, or rather, Allah creates the proton, the neutron, creates the electron. Let's say proton, electron, neutron, for example, three parts. Let's say these are three basic parts. For example, if there is one proton, it becomes hydrogen. If there are six, does it become carbon? If there are six protons, it's carbon. If it's eight, it's oxygen. If there are 84 gold protons, if there are 84 protons, it becomes gold. Look, elements are created according to the number of protons. If there are two, does it become helium? For example, if there are two protons in the nucleus, it is called helium. It becomes something else. If there are three, it becomes something else. There are 109 elements. Look, different elements are created from the same particle by changing the number. There is creativity here. Then, for example, hydrogen is created, oxygen is created. When these two are combined, H2O, then something else called water is created. Look, the material is the same. Their numbers change. There is new creativity. Other things combine with that water. This time, larger things, let's say cells, are created. Let's say genetic material, DNA, is created. Then it goes up to humans. So we see creativity at the atomic level. We see it below it. We see it above it. A new creation, a new one, is seen there. That is, a disposition is seen. When observed, some people of misguidance called materialists within the orderly transformations of particles. For example, there is hydrogen in the sun. Allah creates helium from those hydrogen atoms by causing them to explode. For example, in a second or a minute, 4 million tons of hydrogen are converted to helium. There is creation again. That is within the orderly transformations of particles. Or, for example, if it were at a visible level, Allah creates tomatoes from the soil, for example. That is also a form of creativity. Allah shows Himself at everyone's level. Now this creativity is seen because they felt a great manifestation of divine power. For example, when the sun manifests upon a mirror, a brightness is seen in the mirror. That is a manifestation of the sun is seen. The man will say, well, this is a manifestation of something else. The sun upon this. or he will attribute it to the mirror itself. He will say the mirror possesses light, because there is a manifestation in the mirror. There are two possibilities for that manifestation. Either a manifestation upon it from somewhere else, a manifestation of something else upon it, or the sun is within the mirror. Now they see the manifestation, they see the creation. Since they do not accept that it comes from Allah, from another creator, they are forced to accept matter. Some people of misguidance called materialists, within the orderly transformations of particles, felt a great manifestation of divine creativity and divine power, and being unable to know where that manifestation came from. For example, he says positive attracts negative. That is, he sees a force there, but he cannot know where this attraction comes from. Then he attributes this attraction to the proton, to the electron, being unable to know where it comes from, and being unable to understand where the general force coming from the manifestation of the eternal power is managed. They began attributing divine effects and works to particles and their movements by imagining matter and force as eternal. Now the Master's perspective here is very beautiful. That's why let's proceed through these expressions, because he does not understand the Sharia, which is the sum of spiritual and heavenly laws, and the spiritual principles that come from the commands of the owner of the Sharia, that the congregation is tied with material ropes, and that those strange ropes enslave them and make them move. For example, this is what the scientists say about the law of gravity. For example, they say two masses attract each other. They say we have not yet seen such a force in this matter. For example, now it says this matter attracts matter, right? So we have not seen that force in between in this matter. And we have also not seen the particle that carries this force. That is, how does this interaction go from here to there? What carries this effect? How is the effect transported there? They say they haven't solved that either. But they say our current theory is this. Why? Because the man sees this attraction everywhere. He sees this attraction between any two objects. Okay? He says. He even measures it and puts it into a formula. Then he says, if there is such an attraction, since the reason is that he doesn't accept Allah, he is forced to attribute it to matter. He says there is such a force in matter. But did you see this force in matter? Number. But I saw the result, he says. Yes, I saw the result. I saw the attraction. But did you see that this attraction originates from matter? I didn't see that, he says. But that's my theory, he says. For example, imagining that they are tied with material ropes, and that strange ropes enslave them and make them move. He leaves with an idea so ridiculous that it would make even monster animals in the form of the wildest humans laugh. For example, a proton should repel a proton. Then he says there are quarks inside. He says the quarks between them, he goes to that goes to this, and so on. He says they hold each other in that way. That is, he explains the attraction in a proton, for example, with a particle inside it. For example, if he were to say this is inherent in the nature of the proton, there is no reason, meaning he cannot just say it attracts. Because it is material, he has to show the cause within it, but he shows it in a particle inside it. Therefore, when you ask why that particle attracts, you have to show something else inside that too. You have to show that. It goes on like that. Then the conclusion comes from there. That is, for example, attributes are divided into two. accidental and essential attributes. Essential attributes, accidental attributes. For example, brightness in a mirror is accidental. That is, it is not an attribute of the mirror itself. It appears on it. But for example, if something shines by itself, it is called essential. Now all of Allah's attributes are essential, therefore no reason is shown. That is, the essence, it is said, is like this. But the essence of matter cannot be said because that force disappears. The force goes away. For example, you pull that proton. If you separate it from the quark, if you also break it down, the force disappears. Then it becomes evident that that attribute is accidental. Since it is accidental, it becomes evident that it is not from itself. Then it shows that that thing originates from something else. There is such a thing too. When we analyze force, that is, there is no such force in matter itself. It does not have any property that can be burdened with force in any way. Only because power manifests upon it, they have fabricated such things immediately. So they don't say Allah. That is, let's say something immediately, so that this has become so widespread that even among the most religious, they say plus attracts minus. That is, they have processed it so much. Because if you don't say plus attracts minus, who will you say is the cause of that force? You will say Allah. For example, in order not to say Allah, the man says, look, it attracts a minus. That is, these attract this. How does it attract? Why does it attract? What is attraction? What is force? From where does it attract? Where does this originate from? Then, but why are they swallowing this? There is such a decree there. That is, there is an attraction between plus and minus, a decree. There is a decree placed by Allah. He observes that decree. Then he presents that decree as if it were the ruler. Now the expressions here describe this very well, but we couldn't get there. Just like this analogy, the eternal sultan. Did we read this part? Because he does not understand the Sharia, which is the sum of spiritual and heavenly laws, and the spiritual principles that come from the commands of the owner of the Sharia. Imagining that the congregation is tied with material ropes and that strange ropes enslave them and make them move, he leaves with an idea so ridiculous that it would make even monster animals in the form of the wildest humans laugh. Just like this analogy, a denier who carries the nature of denial, which is pure savageness, enters this world, which is a magnificent barracks of the innumerable soldiers of the eternal and everlasting Sultan, and which is a disciplined mosque of that eternal worshipped one, the spiritual laws of the order of the universe coming from the wisdom of that eternal Sultan. The spiritual laws of the order of the universe coming from the wisdom of that eternal Sultan. Look, this sentence alone describes the issue so beautifully. Order of the universe. Now, when we look at the universe, when we look at the atom, is there an order in the atom? In its nucleus, in its orbit, when we look at its nucleus in the quarks there, or when we look at molecules, all of them, in all molecules, in things, there is an order. From the atom, from inside the quark, all the way up to the entirety of the universe, layer upon layer, Allah has embroidered and arranged the entire universe with an order of the universe, given an order to the universe. Where does this come from? Coming from the wisdom of that eternal Sultan. That is, his wisdom necessitates it this way. Then the spiritual laws of the order of the universe coming from his wisdom. That is, what is beneath this order? There are laws. Imagining those laws as material substances. For example, we looked at the solar system. There is the sun. There are 12 planets around it. There is an order. What does the man say, for example? What is the law of this order? He says it's the law of gravity, for example. He says, according to this law, everything has been given order. Perceiving this order, these laws, as material substances. Well, are laws material substances? For example, in Masnavi, it says based on its uniform continuation. Uniform based on uniform continuation. That is, because it flows always in the same way. For example, the laws reminded me of a hospital, for instance. Let's say there is a law governing the operation of a hospital. Because it always functions according to that. After a while, it's no longer because the law is applied that way, but because it is the law, as the law keeps appearing before one's eyes, the law begins to be perceived as something material. The man says, the law is like this. The system is like this. The law is like this. The system doesn't allow it, he says. In fact, the system, the thing called law, is the command of the person there. If he gives a different command, it changes. But by giving it in the same way over and over, it gains stability in the mind of the person. He says it doesn't change after a while. And then thinking that it is a material, that such a thing really exists, he begins to attribute influence to it, imagining them as material substances. And the conventional laws of the Sultanate of Lordship and the conventional laws of that worshipped one of the Sultanate of Lordship. That is, do laws actually change? Who established the laws? Allah established them. Who applies them? Allah applies them. In fact, because Allah wills it that way. It is conventional, itibari, depending on Allah's will. It doesn't change for us, but if Allah said that positive will not attract negative from now on, but positive will repel positive, it would change. That is, this is because Allah wills it. That's why it is conventional. It can change. There is nothing permanent. The conventional laws of the Sultanate of Lordship and the spiritual and solely intellectual decrees and principles of the great natural law, Sharia Fitriya, of that eternal worshipped one are spiritual. That is, these are in Allah's knowledge. They are spiritual. The decrees and principles that have existence only in knowledge, these are intellectual entities, imagining these as external and material entities. That is, thinking that law has an existence like an atom exists, meaning first attributing a material existence in place of divine power, and then substituting those laws which come from knowledge and speech and have existence only in knowledge in place of divine power, attributing creation to them, then giving them the name nature, and the force which is but a manifestation of divine power. The man says, God forbid, the universe is governed by the laws of physics and chemistry, he says. For example, the man uses this. For example, he says, oh, laws govern it. So what does this man think of law as? A governor. That is, there is something that is like as if there is an entity. That is, he imagines it that way in his mind. It is not like that in reality, but he has reached that point in his world. He imagines it that way. The law he talks about is something conventional. There is no such thing as law in the universe. There are atoms, nothing else. There is no such thing as law. That is, when we were talking with an atheist, he kept saying, law, Law. Okay. He said, bring me the law. We put the matter here. Then we move the atoms one by one here. If there is such a thing as law, the law must remain here. That is, it's not funny, but the man explained it that way. That is, he says laws govern it, for example, here. So there is the law, and there is matter, there are atoms. Draw a line here, he said. Let's move the atoms to this side, then the law should remain here, shouldn't it? He looks, nothing called law remains. That is, there is nothing. But the man begins to believe it that way in his imagination. After a while, attributing creation to them, and then giving them the name nature, and the force which is but a manifestation of divine power, perceiving it as possessing power and being an independent power, is a savageness 1,000 times lower than the savage in the analogy. That is, some people, for example, try to prove Allah's existence, but the man is not aware of what he is doing. He says, look, plus attracts minus, for example. Well, it's over. What else will you explain after you said that? The man is not aware of what he is explaining. RİSALE-İ, that is, the Master's faith is explained faultlessly and perfectly by RİSALE-İ. That is, while explaining it, the man says matter attracts matter. Then he tries to explain Allah. Well, you already attributed Allah's power to matter. Why are you explaining any more? What difference is there left from being a naturalist? That is, after accepting that positive attracts negative. It is a decree. It is a decree placed by Allah. Who is the ruler? Allah is the applier. But when he says it attracts, it is said for a definition. Otherwise, there is no attraction by it. Allah creates the attraction there, originating from them. Then it means he is thinking of other forces besides Allah's power. Then this is no different from being a naturalist. That's why this final summary concludes it. In short, what the naturalists call imaginary and unreal nature is at best, if it has an external reality, only a work of art. It cannot be the artist. It is a print. It cannot be the printer. It is decrees. It cannot be the ruler. It is a natural law, Sharia fitriya. It cannot be the lawgiver. It is a created veil of majesty. It cannot be the creator. It is a passive nature. It cannot be an active doer. It is a law. It is not power. It cannot be the powerful one. It is an instrument, mistar. It cannot be the source, doer, master. For example, instrument, mistar. Source, doer, master. For example, you're writing with a pen. It appears as if the pen is writing. In reality, it is an instrument, mistar, not the source code, doer, master. It appears like the doer. In reality, it is passive. That is, positive attracts negative. It is not the one attracting there. It becomes the recipient of this attraction phenomenon through it. Mistar, it is not the master, but it gets mixed up with the manifestation that is the recipient of the manifestation. That is, it is thought to be from it. For example, if a man sees a pen writing, he thinks the pen is writing, whereas there is no power in the pen. But because it is seen writing, he thinks it is writing, whereas it has neither power nor knowledge. Yes, it goes like this. For the sake of Allah, Fatiha.